The moment my stepmother had security escort me out of my own father's building, I didn't cry. I just smiled, because she had no idea she just fired the only person legally allowed to use the company's recipe. It was a torrential Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of relentless, freezing rain that washes the color out of everything. I was standing in the massive, double-height glass atrium of Hearthstone Confections, the company I had spent 15 years of my life building, holding a cheap brown cardboard box filled with a few desk photos and my favorite coffee mug. Flanking me were two private security guards. One of them, a man named Marcus, who had worked the night shift with me for years, wouldn't even meet my eyes. I could hear his heavy, uncomfortable breathing over the sound of the rain lashing against the glass walls. He was just doing his job, following orders from the new regime. I turned around and looked back up at the second-floor executive mezzanine. Standing there, leaning casually against the frosted glass railing, was my stepmother, Evelyn. She was wearing a pristine ivory-white Alexander McQueen blazer, a stark contrast to the dark, industrial tones of the factory. Beside her stood her biological son, Julian. He was swirling a glass of sparkling water, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. Evelyn raised her hand and offered me a tiny, mocking little wave goodbye. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally amputated me from my father's legacy, leaving them with total, undisputed control of a multi-million-dollar empire. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I just offered a quiet, terrifyingly calm smile, pushed through the revolving glass doors, and walked out into the freezing rain. When I got into my car, the heavy silence of the cabin wrapped around me. I sat there watching the water streak down the windshield, my hands resting on the steering wheel, and I let out a long, slow breath. I was entirely at peace. Because what Evelyn and Julian didn't know, what their expensive, arrogant corporate lawyers had completely failed to uncover, was that they were now holding the keys to an empire that was entirely, legally paralyzed. But to understand how a woman who legally inherited 100% of a company's shares just triggered a $10 million trap that would leave her bankrupt in 7 days, we need to rewind. Before I take you back to the very beginning of this nightmare, please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you believe that karma is best served ice-cold and legally binding. Also, drop a comment down below and let me know, where in the world are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I read every single one. Now, let me tell you how I became the architect of my ex-family's absolute ruin. My name is Clara. Long before the glass boardrooms and the corporate attorneys, Hearthstone Confections was just me, my father Thomas, and a tiny, sweltering commercial kitchen in a bad part of town. My father was a man built of sugar, sweat, and calluses. When I was 12 years old, I wasn't at sleepovers or soccer practice. I was standing on a milk crate, stirring massive copper kettles of boiling caramel. I grew up with the scent of Madagascar vanilla and burnt sugar permanently woven into my hair. If you look at my inner right forearm today, you will see a pale, crescent-shaped burn scar from a splash of boiling toffee when I was 16. I didn't just work for the company. My DNA, my blood, and my youth were mixed into its very foundation. As I reached my early 20s, the company exploded. And it was largely because of me. I spent thousands of hours in the test kitchen perfecting our flagship product, the Hearthstone Artisan Glaze. It was a proprietary, shelf-stable confectionery coating that revolutionized our production line. That single recipe skyrocketed our sales, making up 75% of our global revenue. We were a team. We were happy. Then, my father met Evelyn. Evelyn was an interior designer who smelled strongly of Tom Ford's Black Orchid perfume and ruthless ambition. The heavy, musky floral scent always clashed violently with the sweet vanilla of our factory. She didn't love my father's flour-stained hands. She loved the zeros in his new corporate bank accounts. Within a year, they were married. She moved into his sprawling estate, and she brought her 20-year-old son, Julian, with her. That was the day I stopped being a daughter and became the help. The psychological dynamic shifted with a terrifying, insidious speed. Evelyn was a master of the invisible knife. She was incredibly skilled at making blatant favoritism look like practical parenting. Julian was the textbook definition of a golden child. He was deeply arrogant, completely incompetent, and possessed the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from never facing a single consequence in life. When Julian graduated from a mid-tier private university with a 2.4 GPA in communications, my father, manipulated entirely by Evelyn's whispers, leased him a brand-new metallic blue Maserati Gran Turismo as a graduation gift, paid for entirely by the company. I, on the other hand, was working 70-hour weeks managing the factory floor, driving a 6-year-old Toyota Camry. When I successfully negotiated a raw materials contract that saved the company $400,000 annually, Evelyn threw a small dinner for me. She bought a cheap grocery store cake, patted my shoulder, and told me I was such a reliable little worker. I was the workhorse. Julian was the prince. Let me pause right here and step out of the story for a second. Have you ever experienced the crushing reality of the golden child and scapegoat dynamic? Have you ever watched your parent shower a useless, entitled sibling or step-sibling with luxury, while your own massive sacrifices were treated like a basic, unappreciated expectation? How did you survive that feeling of being completely invisible? Tell me your story in the comments below. Trust me, getting it out helps. Now back to the story. Because the disparity wasn't just in the cars or the money, it was in the daily, psychological torture of Evelyn's gaslighting. Evelyn's cruelty was never loud. She never screamed. She used a fake, sugary sweet tone that disarmed you right before she cut you to the bone. I remember one specific Sunday evening that permanently broke my heart. We were in the kitchen of my father's massive estate. The kitchen island was cold, imported Italian marble. Evelyn was arranging white orchids in a crystal vase. I had just come straight from the factory, wearing my work boots and a flour-dusted uniform. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from manually calibrating a new packaging machine. Julian was sitting at the island, wearing a designer cashmere sweater, complaining loudly that the steering wheel in his Maserati was getting too cold in the mornings, and he needed the company to pay to install a heated one. Evelyn looked up from her orchids. Her eyes swept up and down my dirty uniform, lingering on my scuffed boots with a look of thinly veiled disgust. Then she flashed that pageant queen smile. "Oh, Clara, sweetie," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Look at you. You look absolutely exhausted. I was just telling your father today how blessed we are to have someone who doesn't mind getting her hands dirty. You're such a good little worker bee." I froze, my hand hovering over the refrigerator handle. Evelyn reached over and gently stroked Julian's shoulder. Julian, on the other hand, well, Julian is a visionary. He has a mind for high-level strategy, the C-suite. You simply cannot put a creative, dynamic genius on a factory floor. It just stifles their potential. But you, Clara? You fit right in down there with the machines. It's where you belong. She didn't just insult me. She framed my back-breaking labor and expertise as grunt work, while elevating her lazy son's complete lack of skill into some kind of mystical leadership quality. But the worst part wasn't Evelyn's velvet dagger. It was my father. Thomas was sitting at the breakfast nook, reading a financial report. He heard every single word. I looked at him, desperately waiting for him to lower the papers. Waiting for the man I had built this empire with to look at his new wife and say, "Do not speak to my daughter that way. She is the backbone of this company." My father lowered the report. He looked at me. Then, he looked at Evelyn. He cleared his throat, shifted his gaze down to his coffee cup, and turned the page of his report. He said absolutely nothing. The silence in that kitchen was deafening. It felt like a physical blow to my chest, hollowing me out from the inside. In that exact moment, I realized the horrifying truth. Keeping the peace with his demanding, narcissistic new wife was more important to him than his own daughter's dignity. I swallowed the massive, burning lump in my throat. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I quietly closed the refrigerator, turned around, and walked out the back door into the night. I learned how to be invisible. I learned to swallow my pain, keep my head down, and do my job. But what Evelyn didn't realize was that when you force someone into the shadows, you give them the perfect place to watch, to learn, and to prepare. She thought my silence was submission. She had no idea it was strategy. 2 years ago, the foundation of my world completely crumbled. My father was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. It was aggressive, vicious, and gave us a terrifyingly short timeline. Cancer is a brutal mirror. It reflects the absolute, unfiltered truth about the people surrounding the sickbed. For me, it meant spending every night sleeping in a rigid, uncomfortable vinyl chair in his hospital room, listening to the rhythmic, agonizing hiss of his oxygen machine. I held his thinning, fragile hand for hours, watching the man who built an empire slowly fade away. For Evelyn, however, terminal cancer was simply a business transaction with a ticking clock. Almost immediately, she went to work. Evelyn was ruthless in her isolation tactics. She heavily restricted his visitors, claiming to the nurses that she was protecting his peace and fragile energy. In reality, she was barricading the room to ensure her own aggressive estate attorneys had unimpeded access. While my father was heavily medicated on morphine, drowning in pain, Evelyn was badgering him. She held him psychologically hostage with his own exhaustion. She made it explicitly clear: if he did not sign an updated will leaving 100% of the .0 physical corporate shares of Hearthstone Confections directly to her, she would contest the estate. She threatened to drag the company into a vicious, decades-long probate battle that would financially ruin the business and leave the employees, our extended family, jobless. My father was too weak to fight a divorce. He was too tired for a war. Evelyn knew this. She knew she had him trapped. But Evelyn made one fatal, arrogant miscalculation. She assumed that because my father was quiet, he was defeated. She forgot that before he was a sick old man, he was a ruthless, brilliant entrepreneur who built an empire from a single copper kettle. Exactly 1 month before he died, my father called my cell phone. It was 2 a.m. Evelyn had left the hospital to attend a necessary charity gala, leaving him with a night nurse. His voice was raspy, barely a whisper. "Clara, come to the hospital. Bring a wheelchair. Don't tell anyone." I sneaked him out through the service elevator. He was so frail he barely weighed anything, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. He directed me to drive to the main Hearthstone factory. The building was completely dark, silent except for the hum of the massive industrial refrigerators. The air was thick with the scent of vanilla and roasted cocoa. I pushed his wheelchair down the center aisle, past the massive stainless steel vats we had bought together when I was 16. My father looked at the machines, and then he looked up at me. In the dim emergency lighting, I saw tears pooling in his sunken, tired eyes. "I built a kingdom, Clara," he whispered, his voice trembling with a profound, agonizing regret. "But I let that woman turn it into a cage for you. I was a coward. I let her treat you like dirt because I wanted peace in my house. But there is no peace. I am so sorry." I knelt beside his wheelchair, resting my head on his frail knees, crying silently into the wool blanket. "Dad, it's okay. I don't care about the company. I just want you to be okay." "Listen to me," he interrupted, his grip suddenly tight, his fingers digging into my arm with desperate strength. "Evelyn is going to get the corporate shares. I have to give them to her, or her lawyers will burn this place to the ground in probate court when I die. She will own the brick and mortar. She will own the bank accounts. But she is arrogant, Clara. She thinks a business is just a piece of paper and a bank balance. She doesn't understand what this company actually is. The next morning, we didn't go back to the hospital. We went to a high-rise office building in downtown Chicago to meet with a man my father had contacted in secret. He was a shark-like intellectual property attorney, a man whose tailored suits cost more than my car. For 4 hours, we sat in a mahogany conference room and executed the most brilliant, ruthless legal Trojan horse I have ever seen. Let me explain the law simply, because this is where the trap was set. Owning the shares of a factory does not automatically mean you own the intellectual property, the IP, that the factory uses, provided they are structured as separate legal entities. My father and I established a brand new, completely invisible holding company, Hearthstone IP Holdings LLC. I was named the 100% sole owner. Then my father, acting as the current CEO of the main company, legally transferred every single trademark, the company name, the iconic logo, and all the trade secrets, including the multi-million-dollar patented recipe for the artisan glaze, out of the main corporation and directly into my new LLC. Then came the masterstroke. The main corporation, which Evelyn would soon inherit, signed an exclusive licensing contract with my LLC to use the branding and the recipes. The cost of this license? $1 single a year. To anyone auditing the books, it looked like standard, harmless internal corporate housekeeping, but buried deep on page 42 of the licensing agreement was a key personnel clause. It stated, in airtight, federal-level legal jargon, that the licensing agreement was entirely contingent on the continued, uninterrupted employment of Clara. If I was ever terminated, laid off, or forced to resign, the licensing agreement would be immediately and permanently revoked. My father passed away 4 weeks later. At the reading of the will, Evelyn wore a veil of dramatic black lace and squeezed out a few performative crocodile tears. When the estate lawyer announced that 100% of the corporate shares of Hearthstone Confections were left to her, she didn't even try to hide her triumphant smirk. She looked over at me, sitting quietly in the back row, and her eyes screamed a silent message. I won. You are nothing. I just looked down at my lap, playing the part of the defeated, grieving daughter. Let her have the shares. Let her have the building. I owned the soul. The hostile takeover began before my father's headstone was even engraved. With Thomas gone, Evelyn wasted no time. She immediately installed Julian as the chief executive officer. Julian, a man whose only business experience was managing his own country club bar tab, walked into the factory like he was a conquering king. The environment became instantly, suffocatingly toxic. Julian fired the 20-year veteran floor manager, a man who had attended my high school graduation, simply to replace him with one of his frat brothers. He spent $120,000 of company funds redecorating his office with imported Italian leather furniture and a ridiculous iced-out Rolex he bought himself as a promotion gift. Meanwhile, he canceled the annual holiday bonuses for the warehouse staff, claiming the company needed to tighten its belt. I endured it. For 6 agonizing months, I bit my tongue so hard it bled. I came in at 4 a.m., calibrated the mixers, managed the production line, and kept my father's candy tasting the way it always had. I documented every single change Julian made. I watched them bleed my father's legacy dry, waiting for the inevitable. I knew Evelyn's fragile, narcissistic ego wouldn't let me stay. My mere presence in the building was a threat to her fabricated reality. I was a living, breathing reminder of the man who actually built the company. The ambush happened on a rainy Tuesday in late October. I was on the warehouse floor, covered in powdered sugar and exhaustion, when Julian's terrified new assistant told me I was needed in the executive boardroom. The boardroom had floor-to-ceiling glass walls, specifically designed so everyone on the factory floor could look up and see who was inside. When I walked in, Evelyn was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing her crisp, white Alexander McQueen blazer. Julian was slouched lazily in a chair to her right, mindlessly scrolling on his phone. Sitting nervously at the far end of the table was a spineless, newly hired HR representative who couldn't even make eye contact with me. "Clara, take a seat," Evelyn commanded. She didn't offer a fake smile this time. The sweet Southern Belle act was completely gone. She had the company now, so the mask could finally slip. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. I felt my pulse steady. I knew exactly what this was. "I'll get right to it," Evelyn began, lacing her manicured fingers together, resting them on the table. "Julian and I have been doing a deep dive into the corporate synergy of Hearthstone. We're taking the brand in a more dynamic, aggressive, Ivy League direction. We're looking at luxury lifestyle branding, maybe a high-end apparel line." "Apparel?" I asked, keeping my voice deadpan, completely devoid of emotion. "We sell confectionery glaze, Evelyn." Julian scoffed loudly, finally looking up from his phone, rolling his eyes. "That narrow, small-minded mentality is exactly the problem, Clara. You're thinking like a blue-collar warehouse worker. I'm thinking like a visionary." Evelyn nodded proudly at her son before turning her cold, dead eyes back to me. "Exactly. And frankly, Clara, you're a legacy employee. You're tied to the past. Your massive salary is a drain on our operational budget, and honestly, you just don't fit the new corporate culture." The HR rep swallowed hard and slid a single, pathetic piece of paper across the long table toward me. It was a severance agreement offering me 3 weeks' pay in exchange for a strict non-disparagement clause. "We're letting you go," Evelyn said, her voice laced with absolute, intoxicating glee. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of destroying me. "Effective immediately. Julian will have security escort you to your locker to collect your personal items. Leave your keycard on the table." I looked down at the severance agreement. 3 weeks' pay. For 15 years of my life. For building their flagship products. For the burn scars on my forearms. "You're firing me from my father's company," I said, making sure to articulate every word loudly enough that the HR rep would remember it perfectly for the deposition later. "Without cause." "It's my company now, sweetie," Evelyn sneered, leaning forward, her face twisting into an ugly, triumphant mask. "Your father is dead, and you are nothing but a warehouse worker who overstayed her welcome. Sign the paper, or you don't get the severance pay." I didn't sign the paper. I stood up smoothly, unclipped my keycard from my lanyard, and dropped it onto the glass table. It landed with a sharp, satisfying clack. "I won't be needing the severance," I said quietly. Julian smirked, thoroughly enjoying the show, and signaled the 2 burly security guards waiting outside the glass doors. They walked me to my locker. I packed my framed photo of my father, my favorite coffee mug, and my worn-out notebooks. I walked through the warehouse one last time. The employees I had managed for a decade watched me with wide, shocked eyes. Some of the older women were crying. I didn't cry. As I walked out the revolving glass doors into the freezing rain, holding my sad little cardboard box, I looked back up at the second-floor mezzanine. Evelyn and Julian were standing there, looking down at me, toasting each other with their sparkling water. They thought they had finally, permanently erased me. They didn't know I was walking away to light the match that would burn their entire world to the ground. I didn't just smile. I grinned. Let's pause here for a second and break the fourth wall. I remember standing in that freezing rain holding a cardboard box, looking at the incredibly smug faces of the people who had just stolen my life's work. Have you ever been fired, pushed out, or completely betrayed just so a narcissistic family member could stroke their own pathetic ego? What did they say to you to justify it? How did you survive that moment of pure humiliation? Drop a comment below and share your story. Sometimes the best therapy is exposing the people who tried to break you. Now, let me tell you what happens when a toxic stepmother realizes she just legally detonated her own empire. I drove home, placed my cardboard box on the kitchen counter, and made myself a cup of black coffee. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat at my small dining table, opened my laptop, and watched the second hand on the wall clock tick. I went completely no contact. I blocked Evelyn. I blocked Julian. I deleted my LinkedIn profile. I became a ghost. I knew that in corporate manufacturing, a collapse doesn't happen instantly. It's like cutting the engines on a massive cargo ship. It still glides forward on momentum for a little while before it completely, terrifyingly stalls. I gave them exactly 7 days to enjoy the ride. In the meantime, I called my IP lawyer in Chicago. "They fired me," I said. I could practically hear the shark-like grin through the phone. "I'll draft the paperwork. The trap is sprung." I didn't have to be in the building to know what was happening at Hearthstone Confections. I had fiercely loyal friends on the inside who texted me the slow-motion train wreck in real time. It started quietly on day 3. Julian, trying to prove he was a visionary, attempted to order 100,000 new, redesigned packaging boxes with a slightly tweaked logo. The printing vendor, who was legally thorough and had worked with my father for years, checked the Federal Trademark Registry. They realized the corporate entity requesting the print, Hearthstone Confections, Inc., did not actually own the trademark. They demanded a letter of authorization from the registered IP holder, Hearthstone IP Holdings, LLC. Julian yelled at the vendor over the phone, threatening to pull their million-dollar contract. The vendor calmly hung up and canceled the order. On day 5, the real disaster hit the factory floor. We had just sourced a massive new shipment of raw ingredients to fulfill our biggest quarterly wholesale order. The new head floor manager logged into the central computer system to download the proprietary mixing profiles, the exact temperatures, cooling periods, and measurements required to make the artisan glaze. He was greeted by a black screen and a bold, pulsing red padlock icon. "Access denied. License revoked. Please contact the IP holder." Julian stormed down to the warehouse, his face red with rage, demanding the IT department hack into the system. The IT director couldn't. The system was legally encrypted and tied directly to the licensing agreement I had structured with my lawyer. Julian, in a fit of arrogant panic, ordered the mixers to just wing it and guess the recipe. They burned through 5,000 pounds of premium sugar and proprietary extracts, costing the company nearly $40,000 in a single afternoon. The glaze they did manage to produce tasted like bitter, burnt plastic. It was entirely unsellable. By day 7, the absolute panic was setting in. Wholesale buyers were calling, demanding their delayed shipments. The franchise retail stores were complaining about empty shelves. The company was bleeding cash rapidly, and Evelyn still had no idea why. She was about to find out. On the morning of the 7th day, my lawyer filed the paperwork. We didn't just send a polite warning email, we went nuclear. We filed a massive, brutal cease and desist order, hand-delivered by a process server to the executive boardroom, followed immediately by a $10 million federal lawsuit for trademark infringement and theft of trade secrets. Let me explain the mathematics of their ruin, very simply. Because Evelyn and Julian fired me, they breached the key personnel clause of the licensing agreement. Instantly, their right to use the name Hearthstone Confections, the logo, and the patented recipes evaporated. Evelyn owned the building. She owned the massive mixing vats. She owned the delivery trucks. But she owned a company that legally could not use its own name, could not sell its own candy, and could not use the millions of dollars of packaging sitting in its own warehouse. Every single box of candy they sold after firing me was a federal trademark violation. Which brings us perfectly back to the boardroom. Let's rewind the tape to the exact moment we started. The glass boardroom. The rain. Julian slouched in his chair, Evelyn vibrating with the thrill of destroying me. They thought they had finally stolen a kingdom. Exactly 7 days later, the process server handed Evelyn the thick manila envelope. I was not in the room. I was sitting on my couch in my pajamas, reading a book, waiting for my phone to ring. It rang exactly 14 minutes later. The caller ID flashed. Evelyn. I let it ring 4 times before I casually swiped to answer. Clara speaking. You little bitch. Evelyn shrieked. The fake, sugary Southern Belle was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered, rabid animal. In the background, I could hear Julian yelling at someone, his voice frantic and high-pitched. "What is this? What kind of fraudulent, forged garbage did you send my lawyers?" "I assure you, Evelyn, the federal court stamp is very real," I said, my voice dead calm. I had practiced this tone in the mirror for years, ice cold. "You are holding a cease and desist order." "I own this company," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Thomas left me 100% of the shares. You own nothing. I will have you arrested for extortion." "You own the physical shares of the corporation, Evelyn," I replied smoothly. "And you own the building, the delivery trucks, and the copper vats. But you don't own the brand. You don't own the name Hearthstone, and you certainly don't own the patent for the artisan glaze." Silence on the other end of the line. Just heavy, panicked, hyperventilating breathing. My father and I moved the intellectual property into a separate holding company months before he died, I continued, twisting the knife slowly, legally, and without an ounce of remorse. "You were licensing it from me for $1 a year, but the license required my continued employment. When you smugly fired me to make room for your visionary son, you breached the contract. You revoked your own license. You can't do this." Julian's voice suddenly came through the phone. He had snatched the receiver from his mother. He didn't sound like a CEO. He sounded like a terrified little boy who just broke his mother's expensive vase. "Clara, come on. We're family. We can work this out. Just give us the passwords to the mixing profiles." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. "You want me to think like a visionary, Julian? Fine. Here is my vision. You have 24 hours to take down every single sign bearing my trademarked name. You must immediately halt the sale of any product packaged in my trademarked boxes. If you sell a single ounce of my artisan glaze, I will sue you for $10,000 per daily infraction." "Clara, please!" Evelyn was back on the phone, sobbing now. Real tears. Not the performative ones from the funeral. The terror of impending poverty was clawing at her throat. "We have wholesale contracts to fulfill. The distributors will sue us if we stop supplying the product. We'll go bankrupt." "Then I suggest you start buying generic corn syrup and a label maker," I said. "Because as of right now, you are officially in the business of selling nameless, flavored water." "You planned this!" Evelyn shrieked, the betrayal echoing in the empty factory behind her. "You and Thomas planned this to ruin me." "No, Evelyn," I said, dropping the corporate tone entirely, letting 15 years of pain, gaslighting, and anger crystallize into one final, devastating sentence. "My father gave you a choice. If you had treated me with an ounce of respect, if you had just let me do my job, the license would have remained forever. I would have made you millions. You ruined yourself because your ego was bigger than your brain." I hung up the phone. I didn't block them this time. I wanted to see the missed calls pile up. I wanted them to know I was choosing to ignore them. Let's pause one last time and savor that moment. If you were in my shoes, sitting on the couch, listening to the golden child and the wicked stepmother weeping over the phone as their stolen empire legally collapsed around them, would you have shown them mercy? Would you have negotiated a buyout? Or would you have let it burn to the ground? Tell me your verdict in the comments. The financial collapse of Evelyn and Julian's corporation was spectacular, rapid, and heavily documented by the local business press. Without the right to use the brand name or the recipes, Julian panicked. He bought cheap, generic, wholesale candy and tried to sell it under a new, hastily registered name, Julian's Elite Confections. It was an absolute disaster. The local distributors and franchise owners, who had signed contracts specifically to sell the famous Hearthstone products, immediately sued Evelyn's corporation for breach of contract. They refused to pay for the generic, terrible-tasting garbage. Within 90 days, the company was hemorrhaging cash. Evelyn had to sell her designer clothes, her jewelry, and eventually, the massive estate my father had bought her, just to pay her legal fees and keep the corporation out of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Julian's leased Maserati was repossessed in the middle of the night. They were financially bleeding out. And that is when my lawyer stepped back in. Evelyn's corporation was suffocating under the weight of the distributor lawsuits. She was desperate to sell the physical assets just to stop the bleeding and avoid prison for corporate negligence. My lawyer, acting through an anonymous corporate proxy, approached her and bought the physical factory, the warehouses, and the delivery trucks out of foreclosure. We bought them for pennies on the dollar. When the ink was dry and the funds were transferred, I drove to the factory. Evelyn was in the parking lot, loading a cardboard box of her desk belongings into the trunk of a rented Toyota Corolla. Julian was standing next to her, looking hollowed out and utterly defeated. I pulled up in my car. I didn't rub it in. I didn't say a word. I just got out, unlocked the front doors of the facility with my new keys, and walked inside. The next morning, I reinstated every single veteran employee that Julian had fired. I gave them back pay and a 15% raise. I unlocked the computer systems. The smell of caramelized sugar and vanilla filled the warehouse once again. I am now the sole, undisputed CEO and 100% owner of the entire empire. Looking back, the greatest gift my father left me wasn't the intellectual property, and it wasn't the company. His greatest gift was the mechanism to finally, legally, set a boundary with my abusers. When you grow up as the invisible child, you are taught a concept called conditional self-worth. You are taught that your value is tied entirely to how useful you are to the toxic people in your life. Evelyn made me feel like I was nothing but the help. She tried to convince me that I was small, that I was worthless without her permission to exist in my own father's company. But I learned that you don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge is absolute, chilling silence, backed by an airtight legal contract. If you are dealing with a toxic family member, a narcissistic boss, or someone who treats you like you are invisible, hear me now. They only have the power you allow them to have. Build your skills in the dark. Educate yourself. Know your worth. Let them underestimate you. Let them think they have won. And then, when the time is right, let your success be the loudest noise in the room. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found a piece of yourself in this, or if you just love watching karma do its job, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.